I caught my breath when his coworker whispered, "Don't go, he's not going where you think." The chill ran deeper than the January wind in Chicago that night, and my heart shattered silently. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Margaret, and at 63, I thought I knew what love looked like. I thought I understood the shape of marriage after 38 years. I was wrong about so many things, but most of all, I was wrong about myself. Every morning began the same way in our cramped apartment near Wicker Park. The radiator clanged like an angry ghost, and the thin walls couldn't keep out the city's relentless noise. I'd wake before dawn, my body aching from the pull-out couch that had become my bed after he claimed the bedroom for his workspace. The coffee maker gurgled, filling our small kitchen with the only warmth I could count on. I'd stand there in my worn robe, the one with tiny roses that had faded to ghosts, watching the steam rise from my cup. The scent of stale cinnamon rolls lingered from better days, when I still baked on Sundays, when he still smiled at my efforts. Above the stove, photos were taped in a neat row: our wedding day, the kids' graduations, family vacations when we could afford them. In those frozen moments, we looked happy. We looked like people who belonged together. That particular Tuesday evening in January, hope fluttered in my chest like a caged bird. I'd planned something special. David had mentioned a work dinner, some important client meeting at a fancy restaurant downtown. I thought I'd surprise him afterward. Maybe we could walk along the lakefront despite the cold. Maybe we could remember why we'd fallen in love in that same city 39 years ago. I spent the afternoon preparing. I washed my graying hair until it shone, put on the burgundy dress he'd once said made my eyes sparkle. I even splurged on a small bouquet of winter roses from the corner shop on Milwaukee Avenue. The florist, a kind woman with paint-stained fingers, smiled when I told her they were for a surprise. "Lucky man," she said, and I felt young again for just a moment. The restaurant was in River North, one of those places with soft lighting and prices that made my stomach turn. I'd called ahead, asked if I could wait at the bar until his party arrived. The hostess had been accommodating, probably taking pity on the nervous older woman clutching flowers like a lifeline. That's when I saw her. David's coworker, Linda, from his insurance office. She was leaving as I arrived, wrapping a silk scarf around her neck, her face troubled. Our eyes met across the crowded entrance, and something passed between us, a recognition, maybe, or a warning. "Margaret," she said, approaching hesitantly. "What are you doing here?" "I'm surprising David," I said, holding up the roses like evidence of my good intentions. "He's having dinner with clients." Linda's face changed. The color drained from her cheeks, and she glanced back toward the dining room, then at me, then away. She was wrestling with something, some knowledge that sat heavy on her shoulders. "Don't go," she whispered, leaning close enough that I could smell her perfume, something expensive and floral. "He's not going where you think." The words hit me like ice water. "What do you mean?" But Linda was already backing away, shaking her head, her eyes filled with something that looked like pity. "I'm sorry," she mouthed, and then she was gone, swallowed by the Chicago night. I stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. The roses were wilting in my grip, their petals browning at the edges. Around me, couples laughed over wine glasses, their faces glowing in the candlelight. I felt ancient standing there, invisible and out of place. The smart thing would have been to leave. The safe thing would have been to go home, pretend this moment never happened, continue living in the comfortable lie I'd built around my marriage. But something in Linda's voice, some desperate urgency, kept my feet planted on that marble floor. I asked the hostess to point out David's table. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we don't have anyone by that name dining with us tonight." The words echoed in my head as I walked home through streets that had never felt colder. "Don't go. He's not going where you think." The roses ended up in a trash can outside the L station, their brief beauty wasted on my foolish hope. Back in our apartment, I sat in the dark, still wearing the burgundy dress. The city hummed beyond our windows, millions of people living their lives, loving and lying and breaking each other's hearts. I wondered how many of them felt as lost as I did in that moment. David came home near midnight, reeking of wine and someone else's perfume. His shirt was wrinkled in ways that spoke of intimate moments, and there was lipstick, not my shade, on his collar. "How was the client dinner?" I asked from the darkness of our living room. He jumped, not expecting me to be awake. "Fine. Boring. You know how these things are." But I didn't know. I never had. Because in 38 years of marriage, he'd never once invited me to join him, never once suggested I might be interesting enough company for his professional world. That night, lying on my pull-out couch while he snored in what used to be our bed, I began to connect dots I'd been avoiding for years. The late nights. The mysterious phone calls. The way he'd started dressing better, caring about his appearance in ways he never had during our early years together. The way he'd started treating me like a roommate instead of a wife. Looking back now, I can see the pattern was always there. I just chose not to see it, the same way I chose not to see so many things that would have forced me to make choices I wasn't ready for. It started slowly, the way these things always do. Small compromises that grew into larger ones, tiny erosions of self that eventually carved out canyons. When we first married, I'd been teaching second grade at a school in Lincoln Park. I loved those children with their gap-toothed grins and endless questions. I loved shaping their minds, watching understanding dawn in their bright eyes. But when David struggled to find steady work in the early 80s, when the economy was tight and opportunities scarce, I volunteered to carry us both. It's temporary, he promised, kissing my forehead as I handed him my teaching salary, month after month. Just until I get the business off the ground. The business was going to be everything, a small insurance agency that would secure our future, set us up for retirement, maybe even build something to pass down to our children. It sounded reasonable. It sounded like love. I gave him my savings account, the modest inheritance from my grandmother, the emergency fund I'd been building since college. I believe in you, I said, because that's what loving wives do. They believe. Years passed. The business limped along, never quite failing but never quite succeeding either. I went back to teaching, but part-time now, covering the gaps when clients didn't pay or deals fell through. Our conversations became focused on money, who owed what, which bills were overdue, how we'd manage the next crisis. Why can't you trust me? He'd snap when I asked about the accounts, about why we never seemed to have enough despite my steady work. I'm doing the best I can. So I stopped asking. I stopped questioning the credit card statements I never saw, the business trips that multiplied like rabbits, the wardrobe upgrades that somehow never extended to me. I folded into myself, making do with less so he could have more, telling myself this was what partnership looked like. Our son, Michael, was born when I was 28. Our daughter, Sarah, followed 3 years later. They became my world in ways that probably weren't healthy, but they filled the spaces where David's attention used to live. I threw myself into motherhood with the same fierce dedication I'd once given to teaching, and David seemed grateful for the reduced expectations. "You're such a good mother," he'd say, and I'd glow under the rare praise, not realizing it was also a dismissal. Good mothers don't ask difficult questions. Good mothers make do. The kids grew up understanding, on some level, that daddy was under pressure, that money was always tight, that mommy worked extra hours to keep us afloat. Michael became serious beyond his years, shoulders bent under the weight of being the man of the house even as a child. Sarah learned to expect less, to celebrate small victories, to never ask for things that might stress the family budget. I told myself we were teaching them valuable lessons about resilience and sacrifice. Really, we were teaching them that love looked like giving until you disappeared. When the kids were teenagers, David's business finally found some footing. A partnership with a larger firm brought steady income, even started generating what seemed like real money. I expected our lives to improve, expected some of the pressure to ease. Instead, David found new ways to spend, new reasons why we couldn't quite get ahead. There was always something. A business trip to a conference that would boost our fortunes. New equipment that was essential for growth. Clothes that projected success to potential clients. A car that wouldn't embarrass him in parking lots filled with businessmen who might judge our family by what we drove. "Trust me," became his answer to everything. "This is how business works. You have to spend money to make money." The trouble was, I was the one spending. My teaching salary, now full-time again, covered our daily expenses while his business income disappeared into investments I couldn't track, opportunities one wasn't qualified to understand, and the mysterious category of networking that seemed to require expensive dinners and weekend trips I was never invited to join. By the time Michael graduated high school and Sarah was a junior, I'd been teaching for over 20 years. I loved my students, loved the rhythm of the school year, loved feeling useful and valued in a way I hadn't felt at home in years. But the long days were catching up with me. My back ached from bending over small desks. My voice grew hoarse from reading aloud and explaining math concepts and mediating playground disputes. "Why don't you retire early?" David suggested one evening, not looking up from his laptop screen. "The business is doing well enough now. We could manage on my income." The idea terrified and tempted me in equal measure. I was tired, bone-deep weary in ways that went beyond physical exhaustion. But teaching was my identity, my independence, the one area of my life where I still felt competent and valued. "Are you sure?" I asked. "What about Sarah's college expenses? What about retirement savings?" "Trust me," he said again, still not looking at me. "I've got it handled." So I retired at 57, 6 months before I'd planned, turning in my classroom keys and my gradebook with a mixture of relief and loss that I couldn't quite name. For the first time in decades, I had nowhere I needed to be, no one depending on me to show up every day. I thought it would be liberating. Instead, it was isolating. David's business trips multiplied. His networking events expanded to include weekend conferences and client dinners that stretched past midnight. He joined a gym and started caring about his appearance in ways that reminded me of our dating days, except now the effort was never for my benefit. The money I'd expected to ease our daily pressures never seemed to trickle down to our actual life. We still lived in the same cramped apartment. We still drove the same aging car. We still shopped carefully and counted pennies, while David's business wardrobe grew more expensive and his lifestyle more demanding. Where does it all go? I finally asked one evening, after he'd mentioned needing another business trip, this one to a conference in Las Vegas. Margaret, he said, his voice carrying that edge of impatience I'd learned to recognize and fear. I've been handling the finances for 30 years. Do you really think you understand business better than I do? The dismissal stung, but worse was the implication that I was too simple, too naive, too limited to understand the complexities of our financial life. I retreated into silence, into the assumption that he must be right, that my concerns were the product of ignorance rather than intuition. But doubts crept in anyway. They came in quiet moments, when I was alone in the apartment with nothing but time to think. They whispered when I noticed his phone always face down on the table, when calls went unanswered in my presence, when he started showering immediately after coming home from work. Family first, I repeated like a mantra, the way my mother had taught me, the way her mother had taught her. Marriage is work. Love is a choice. Trust is a gift. But slowly, imperceptibly, I began to wonder if I was the wife or the caretaker. If my love was being met with love, or just being consumed by need. If the gift of my trust was being treasured or simply taken for granted. The wondering felt like betrayal, so I pushed it down. I focused on keeping house, on caring for David's needs, on maintaining the illusion that we were a team even when it felt like I was the only one playing the game. I cooked his favorite meals and he ate them without comment. I managed his schedule and he criticized my reminders. I selected his clothes for important meetings and he changed into something else, something that suggested my taste wasn't sophisticated enough for his professional image. Slowly, so slowly I barely noticed, I began to disappear. My own needs became theoretical. My own wants became background noise. My own dreams, of travel, of hobbies, of friendships that extended beyond the grocery store clerk who knew my name, became luxuries we couldn't afford, despite the mysterious prosperity of David's business. The kids, grown now and building their own lives, called dutifully but briefly. They'd absorbed the family pattern of giving David space, of managing around his moods, of accepting that his needs came first. When I tried to share my growing loneliness, they offered surface solutions. Maybe you should get a hobby, Mom, Michael suggested during one of our monthly phone calls. Dad works hard. You should find something to keep you busy. Busy. As if the problem were boredom rather than erasure. Sarah was more direct. You've never had your own interests, she said during a rare visit home. Maybe this is your chance to figure out who you are besides Dad's wife. The comment was meant to be encouraging, but it highlighted something I'd been trying not to see. I'd become so focused on being David's wife that I'd forgotten how to be Margaret. The woman who'd once loved teaching, who'd dreamed of traveling, who'd had opinions about books and movies and politics that weren't simply echoes of her husband's views. Who was I when no one needed me to be anyone in particular? The question haunted me through long afternoons in our empty apartment. I tried to establish routines that felt meaningful, reading library books, taking walks through Lincoln Park, volunteering at a local food bank. But everything felt temporary, like placeholder activities for a life that was supposed to start eventually. Meanwhile, David's world expanded. His business trips became more frequent, his wardrobe more expensive, his schedule more demanding. He joined professional organizations I'd never heard of, attended industry events I wasn't invited to, built relationships that didn't include me. You wouldn't be interested, became his response when I asked about his evening plans. It's just shop talk. You'd be bored. Maybe he was right. Maybe I would have been bored by conversations about insurance policies and client relations and market strategies. But I would have liked the chance to find out. I would have liked to feel included in the life we were supposedly building together. Instead, I felt like a background character in his story, present but not participating, necessary but not valued. The loneliness was profound and persistent, made worse by the fact that it existed within a marriage, surrounded by the appearance of companionship. When people asked how I was enjoying retirement, how David was doing, whether we had plans for the holidays, I learned to smile and offer the expected answers. Oh, David's business is going so well. We're very proud of how hard he's worked. Things are good. We're blessed. The words became automatic, a shield against questions I couldn't answer honestly without revealing the emptiness that had taken root in the center of my life. But late at night, lying on the pull-out couch that had somehow become my permanent bed, I couldn't shield myself from the truth. Something was wrong. Something had been wrong for years, maybe decades. And I was running out of energy to pretend otherwise. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in January, when winter had settled over Chicago like a punishment and the apartment felt smaller than ever. I was 59 by then, 2 years into retirement, drowning in time that stretched endlessly with no purpose to shape it. David had mentioned a work dinner, some important client meeting at an upscale restaurant in River North. As he prepared to leave, adjusting his tie and checking his appearance in the hallway mirror, I felt that familiar flutter of being left behind. "What time will you be home?" I asked, the same question I'd been asking for years, always hoping for an answer that suggested I mattered in his calculations. "Late," he said, not looking at me. "Don't wait up." After he left, I sat in the darkening apartment, listening to the city beyond our windows. Somewhere out there, people were sharing meals, building relationships, creating memories that would sustain them through difficult times. I wanted to be one of those people. I wanted to matter to someone other than myself. That's when the idea took shape, fragile and desperate but surprisingly strong. I would surprise him. I would show up at the restaurant, not as the forgotten wife waiting at home, but as a partner claiming her place in his life. Maybe he'd be embarrassed at first, but maybe he'd also be pleased. Maybe he'd remember that I existed, that I was more than the invisible force keeping his domestic life running smoothly. I spent the afternoon preparing like I was getting ready for a first date. I washed my hair until it gleamed, chose the burgundy dress that used to be his favorite, applied makeup with shaking hands that remembered how to make eyes sparkle and lips smile. At the corner flower shop on Milwaukee Avenue, I bought a small bouquet of winter roses, their deep red petals like drops of hope against the gray day. "For someone special?" the florist asked, her hands stained with paint from the artwork displayed around her small shop. "My husband," I said, the words feeling strange in my mouth. When was the last time I'd spoken of David as someone special rather than someone to be managed around? "Lucky man," she replied with a genuinely warm smile that made me feel, for just a moment, like maybe I was worth the effort I was making. The restaurant was exactly the kind of place David's business success should have afforded us as a couple but never had. Soft lighting, crisp white tablecloths, the kind of attention to detail that cost money and spoke of celebration. I felt out of place but determined, a woman claiming space in a world that had subtly but persistently excluded her. The hostess was accommodating when I explained that I wanted to surprise my husband, that he was dining with clients and I hoped to wait at the bar until his party arrived. She seated me where I could see the entrance and most of the dining room, offering me a glass of wine that I nursed while scanning faces for the one I'd been married to for 38 years. That's when Linda appeared, wrapping a silk scarf around her neck as she prepared to leave. Linda from David's office, the woman who answered his phone when I called, who scheduled his appointments and managed his calendar with an efficiency I envied. Our eyes met across the restaurant's elegant entrance, and something passed between us. Recognition, certainly. But something else too. Something that looked like guilt, or pity, or the weight of knowledge too heavy for one person to carry alone. "Margaret," she said, approaching my table with hesitant steps. "What are you doing here?" I held up the roses like evidence of my good intentions, my reasonable hopes. "I'm surprising David. He said he had a client dinner tonight." The change in Linda's expression was immediate and devastating. Color drained from her face. Her eyes darted toward the dining room, then back to me, then away entirely. She was wrestling with something, some information that sat between us like a landmine. For a long moment, she said nothing. The restaurant hummed around us, conversation and laughter, the clink of silverware against porcelain, the murmur of lives intersecting over shared meals. Normal sounds from a normal evening that was about to become anything but normal. "Don't go," she finally whispered, leaning close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume, see the conflict in her eyes. "He's not going where you think." The words hit me like ice water, immediate and shocking. "What do you mean?" But Linda was already backing away, shaking her head as if she regretted the warning even as she gave it. The pity in her expression was unmistakable now, the look someone gives when they've delivered news that will change everything. "I'm sorry," she mouthed, and then she was gone, swallowed by the Chicago night that suddenly seemed darker and colder than when I'd arrived. I sat there for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the roses wilting in my grip. Around me, couples shared intimate conversations over candlelit tables, their faces glowing with connection and contentment. I felt ancient among them, invisible and irrelevant, a woman who'd mistaken loneliness for love and loyalty for partnership. The smart thing would have been to leave. The safe thing would have been to go home, throw away the roses, pretend this evening had never happened. Continue living in the comfortable lie that had sustained me for years, the fiction that David's absence was about work rather than choice, his distance about stress rather than indifference. But Linda's words echoed in my mind with the persistence of truth. "Don't go. He's not going where you think." There was urgency in her voice, desperation in her eyes, the weight of knowledge she'd finally decided to share. So I asked the hostess to point out David's table. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we don't have anyone by that name dining with us tonight." The words hit me like a physical blow. No reservation under his name. No client dinner. No business meeting that required his absence from home, from me, from the life we'd supposedly built together. I walked home through streets that had never felt colder, the roses ending up in a trash can outside the L station. Their beauty was wasted now, their promise unfulfilled, their brief life a metaphor for hopes I couldn't afford to maintain. Back in our apartment, I sat in the dark, still wearing the burgundy dress that had once made his eyes light up. The city hummed beyond our windows, but the sound felt distant now, like noise from another planet where people lived authentic lives with partners who valued their presence. David came home near midnight, and even in the darkness I could see the evidence of an evening spent elsewhere. His shirt was wrinkled in ways that spoke of intimacy. There was perfume clinging to his clothes, something floral and expensive that wasn't mine. Lipstick on his collar in a shade I'd never worn. "How was the client dinner?" I asked from the shadows of our living room. He jumped, startled by my voice in the darkness. "Fine. Boring. You know how these things are." But I didn't know. I'd never known, because in 38 years of marriage, he'd never once invited me along, never once suggested that I might be interesting enough company for his professional world, never once acted like my presence would enhance rather than diminish his important business relationships. "Which restaurant did you go to?" I asked, my voice carefully neutral. "That new place downtown," he said vaguely, already moving toward the bedroom, toward escape from questions he didn't want to answer. But there was no new place downtown. No client dinner. No boring evening spent tolerating business conversations for the sake of our family's financial future. That night, lying on my pull-out couch while he snored in what used to be our shared bed, I began connecting dots I'd been avoiding for years. The late nights that had nothing to do with work. The mysterious phone calls taken in other rooms. The way he'd started caring about his appearance, dressing better, paying attention to details that had never mattered during our early years together. The way he'd gradually moved me from partner to caretaker, from wife to roommate, from equal participant to invisible support system. The money that flowed through our lives but never seemed to improve them. The business success that somehow never translated into security or comfort or shared experiences. The lifestyle that supported his expanding world while leaving mine smaller and smaller. I'd been so focused on being a good wife that I'd forgotten to notice whether he was being a good husband. So committed to honoring my vows that I'd ignored how thoroughly he'd abandoned his. The realization didn't come all at once. It crept over me slowly, like water seeping through a damaged foundation, gradually undermining the structure I'd built my life on. For weeks after that night at the restaurant, I moved through our daily routines with new eyes, seeing patterns I'd previously dismissed as quirks of personality or necessities of business. David's phone was always face down when he was home. Always. Calls went to voicemail when I was in the room. Text messages were read quickly and deleted immediately. When I asked innocent questions about his day, his answers were vague in general, lacking the specific details that make honest communication feel natural. "How was the Morrison account meeting?" I might ask, remembering a name from his calendar. "Fine," he'd say, not looking up from his laptop. Same old stuff. No stories about interesting people or challenging problems. No requests for advice or invitations to share in his professional world. No sense that I was connected to the work that supposedly supported our life together. Meanwhile, his appearance continued to improve. New clothes appeared in his closet without explanation. His gym membership, which had been dormant for years, suddenly became a daily priority. He started getting his hair cut more frequently, switched to expensive cologne, paid attention to details of grooming that had never mattered when he had only me to impress. "You look nice," I said one evening as he prepared for another mysterious networking event. "Thanks," he replied, but his attention was focused on his reflection in the hallway mirror, not on the woman who'd noticed his efforts. The networking events were multiplying too. Industry conferences that required weekend travel. Client dinners that stretched past midnight. Professional development seminars that somehow never resulted in certificates or increased knowledge that he could share with me. "What did you learn at the seminar?" I asked after one particularly elaborate weekend absence. "Marketing strategies," he said dismissively. "You wouldn't understand the technical aspects." The constant dismissals were wearing me down. Every conversation became a reminder that I wasn't smart enough, sophisticated enough, relevant enough to participate in his expanding world. I was useful for maintaining the domestic infrastructure that supported his success, but not interesting enough to include in the success itself. When people asked how retirement was treating me, I learned to give answers that protected both of us from uncomfortable truths. "Oh, David's business is doing so well. I'm proud of how hard he works. We're very blessed." But privately, I was struggling with questions I couldn't answer. Where was all this success leading? When would it translate into a life we could share? How much networking was necessary to maintain relationships with clients I'd never met, colleagues I'd never been introduced to, business associates who apparently required David's attention several nights a week. The loneliness was becoming unbearable. Not the temporary loneliness of missing someone who's temporarily absent, but the deeper loneliness of being unseen by someone who's physically present. David and I could spend entire evenings in the same apartment without anything resembling real conversation. We could share meals without sharing thoughts. We could exist in the same space while living completely separate lives. I started questioning everything. Was this normal in long marriages? Was I expecting too much? Had I become boring, demanding, clingy in ways that drove him to seek stimulation elsewhere? Maybe the problem was me. Maybe I'd grown too dependent on his attention, too needy for connection, too limited by my small world to appreciate the complexity of his larger one. Maybe good wives supported their husband's success without requiring inclusion in it. But doubt crept in anyway, whispering uncomfortable questions during long afternoons alone in the apartment. If David's business was truly thriving, why did we still live paycheck to paycheck? If his professional relationships were purely business, why was he never willing to include me in any of them? If his evening absences were truly about work, why did he come home smelling like wine and perfume and intimacy? The questions multiplied in the dark, keeping me awake long after David's satisfied snoring from the bedroom suggested he had no similar concerns troubling his rest. I tried to rationalize everything. Successful businessmen probably did need to network extensively. Professional relationships probably did require socializing that might be boring for spouses. Marriage probably did naturally evolve toward more independence and less constant togetherness as couples aged and found their individual rhythms. But rationalization couldn't explain away Linda's warning. Don't go. He's not going where you think. The urgency in her voice suggested knowledge that went beyond general marital advice. The guilt in her eyes implied specific information she felt obligated to share, even at personal cost. I started paying attention to details I'd previously ignored. The way David showered immediately after coming home from work, before greeting me or sharing any part of his day. The way he guarded his phone and laptop, changing passwords and positions so screens were never visible when I was nearby. The way he developed a whole vocabulary of vague nouns, meeting, event, obligation, that provided the appearance of communication without any actual information. I have plans tonight, he might say, not, I'm taking Jennifer Morrison to dinner to discuss her life insurance needs. The conference was productive, rather than, I learned 3 new marketing techniques that could improve our client retention. Networking is essential in my line of work, instead of, I spent the evening talking with colleagues about industry trends and building relationships that benefit our family's financial security. The more I paid attention, the more suspicious I became. And the more suspicious I became, the more guilty I felt for doubting the man I'd promised to trust and honor for better or worse. But worse was exactly what this felt like. Not the obvious worse of illness or financial catastrophe, but the subtle worse of erosion, of gradual disconnection, of a partnership that had somehow become a performance where only one person knew the script. I was 60 years old, 3 years into a retirement I'd been told to embrace, living in an apartment I'd been told we couldn't afford to leave, married to a man whose success never seemed to benefit anyone but himself. My days stretched endlessly with no structure beyond his schedule, no purpose beyond his comfort, no identity beyond his wife. And I was starting to suspect that even that identity was more fiction than fact. The suspicion crystallized into certainty on a Thursday morning in late January. David was in the shower, preparing for another day of meetings I wouldn't be told about, and his phone was charging on the kitchen counter. It buzzed with a text message. I wasn't trying to spy. I wasn't deliberately violating his privacy. But the phone was face up for once, and the message preview was visible before the screen locked again. Can't wait for tonight. Same place? The number wasn't saved in his contacts. The message could have been from anyone about anything. A business associate confirming a meeting location. A colleague suggesting a restaurant for a client dinner. An innocent communication that had nothing to do with the fears that had been building in my mind for weeks. But the language was wrong. Business communications don't typically express excited anticipation. Professional relationships don't usually involve repeated visits to the same undisclosed location. Innocent messages don't require the kind of privacy David maintained around all his electronic communications. I stood there staring at the blank phone screen, my coffee growing cold in my hands, while the shower ran and steam seeped under the bathroom door. The radiator clanged its familiar complaint. The city rumbled to life beyond our windows. Everything was exactly the same as it had been 5 minutes earlier, except now I knew with absolute certainty that nothing was the same at all. That evening, David announced his plans with the same casual dismissal he'd perfected over months of similar announcements. I have to work late tonight. Don't wait up. Working where? I asked, testing. The office, he said without hesitation. End of month reports. But I'd called his office the previous week and learned they closed at 5:30. The building was locked and alarmed after 6. There was no working late at the office, just like there had been no client dinner at the restaurant that didn't have his reservation. After he left, I sat in the darkening apartment with a decision crystallizing in my mind. I could continue pretending not to know what I knew. I could keep living the fiction we'd constructed together, accepting my role as the unsuspecting wife who maintained the domestic foundation while he lived a separate life I wasn't meant to discover. Or I could find out exactly where he went when he claimed to be going to work. The choice between comfortable denial and uncomfortable truth felt like the most important decision I'd made in years. Maybe decades. I chose truth. David's office building was dark when I arrived just after 7 o'clock. The parking lot was empty except for a security guard's car and a few vehicles that probably belonged to overnight maintenance staff. No sign of David's Honda, no indication that anyone was working late on end-of-month reports. I'd brought my camera, though I wasn't sure exactly what I intended to document. Evidence felt important, proof that my suspicions weren't products of an overactive imagination or midlife paranoia. Something concrete I could point to when the time came for honest conversation. I waited in my car for 20 minutes, hoping I was wrong, hoping David's Honda would pull into the lot and validate at least this one claim about working late. But the only activity was the security guard making his rounds, checking doors that were already locked, ensuring the building remained secure for another night. At 7:30, I drove to the restaurant where Linda had warned me not to go. The same upscale place in River North where David supposedly had client dinners he never actually attended. I found his car in the lot across the street. My hands were shaking as I crossed the intersection, trying to look casual while my heart hammered against my ribs. Through the restaurant's large windows, I could see couples sharing intimate dinners, their faces glowing in candlelight that suggested romance rather than business. I spotted David immediately. He was at a corner table, leaning across white linen toward a woman I didn't recognize. She was younger than me by at least 15 years, blonde where I was graying, elegant in ways I'd given up trying to achieve. Her laugh was audible even through the glass, bright and musical and delighted. David's expression was one I remembered from our early dating days. Animated. Engaged. Present in a way he hadn't been with me in years. His hand was covering hers on the table between them. His eyes never left her face. He looked like a man falling in love, or deepening a love that was already well established. I stood on the sidewalk for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, watching my husband court another woman with an attention and energy he'd long since stopped directing toward me. They weren't discussing insurance policies or client strategies or any aspect of the business that supposedly required so much of his evening time. They were having the kind of dinner I'd dreamed of sharing with him. The kind of conversation I'd hoped we might rediscover if I could just be patient enough, supportive enough, understanding enough to wait for his stress to ease and his attention to return to our marriage. But his attention hadn't wandered due to temporary pressures. It had been deliberately redirected. The energy I'd been missing hadn't evaporated, it had been invested elsewhere. I walked back to my car on legs that felt disconnected from my body, drove home through streets that blurred with tears I hadn't realized I was crying. The apartment felt different when I entered it, smaller and shabbier and saturated with the reality I could no longer avoid. I was married to a man who was building a life that didn't include me. David came home near midnight with the same satisfied exhaustion I'd been interpreting as evidence of hard work and professional dedication. He showered immediately, changed into fresh clothes, and settled into bed without asking about my day or sharing any meaningful details about his own. "How were the reports?" I asked into the darkness. "Tedious," he mumbled, already half asleep. "Same numbers, different month." I lay on my pull-out couch listening to him snore, staring at shadows on the ceiling, trying to process the gap between what I'd believed about my marriage and what I'd witnessed that evening. 38 years. More than half my life committed to a partnership that had apparently become a one-sided arrangement I'd been too trusting, too loyal, or too afraid to examine honestly. The betrayal wasn't just about another woman, though that was devastating enough. It was about the lies that made the other woman possible. The financial manipulation that allowed him to afford a lifestyle I wasn't invited to share. The emotional withholding that had gradually starved our connection while he cultivated intimacy elsewhere. It was about the way he'd trained me to ask for less, expect less, accept less, until I'd nearly disappeared entirely from my own life. But I hadn't disappeared completely. Not yet. Lying there in the dark, I began to understand that I had choices I hadn't recognized before. I could continue being the faithful wife who pretended not to know what she knew. I could confront David with evidence and hope for explanations that might somehow make sense of years of deception. Or I could start building a life that didn't depend on his attention, his honesty, or his love. The last option terrified me more than the others, but it also felt like the only one that offered any possibility of genuine hope. For the first time in years, I started thinking about what I wanted rather than what everyone else needed from me. What I wanted was to matter to someone. What I wanted was to be seen and valued and included. What I wanted was to live authentically instead of performing a role that had gradually hollowed out my sense of self. What I wanted was to find my way back to Margaret, the woman I'd been before I became so focused on being David's wife that I forgot how to be anything else. The next morning, I began taking small steps toward reclaiming my life. I started by doing something I hadn't done in months. I made plans that had nothing to do with David's schedule. I called the local library and asked about volunteer opportunities. The librarian, a warm woman named Patricia, invited me to come in that afternoon to discuss their reading program for adults learning English as a second language. "We need someone patient," she said. "Someone who understands that learning takes time and kindness." For the first time in weeks, I felt useful in a way that had nothing to do with cooking meals that weren't appreciated or managing schedules for someone who didn't value my efforts. That afternoon, I met Rosa, a woman from Guatemala who was studying for her citizenship test while working 2 jobs and raising 3 children. Her determination was inspiring, her gratitude for my help genuine and immediate. "You teach good," she said after our first session, her English careful but heartfelt. "I learn much." The simple appreciation filled spaces in my heart I hadn't realized were empty. Teaching had always been my calling, and I'd missed the connection with students who actually wanted to learn from me. I also started paying attention to our finances in ways I'd avoided for years. David had always handled the money, claiming superior knowledge of business and investment while treating my questions as evidence of distrust or limitation. But I wasn't limited. I was rusty. A visit to our bank revealed information that shouldn't have surprised me but did. David's business account, which I'd assumed was growing steadily along with his professional success, contained less money than my teaching pension. The credit cards I thought were being paid off each month were actually accumulating balances at high interest rates. The expensive clothes, the frequent dinners out, the networking events that required such elaborate preparation, all of it was being funded by debt rather than success. We weren't building toward financial security. We were sliding toward financial ruin, and I was the only one who seemed concerned about stopping the slide. "I'd like to see all our account statements," I told the bank representative, a young man who looked uncomfortable discussing financial details with someone who technically had every right to the information. "Your husband usually handles these requests," he said diplomatically. "My husband isn't here," I replied. "I am." The statements painted a picture of financial management that was chaotic at best, deceptive at worst. Money flowed in from my pension and David's business, then flowed out to restaurants, hotels, retail stores, and cash withdrawals that left no paper trail. There were charges to businesses I didn't recognize in amounts that suggested luxury rather than necessity. Payment to services I'd never heard of, for purposes I couldn't imagine. We were living above our means while I lived below any reasonable standard of comfort or inclusion. That evening, I tried to discuss what I'd learned. "I went to the bank today," I said while David was scrolling through his phone at our small kitchen table. He looked up with an expression of mild annoyance. "What for?" "To understand our financial situation. I'm concerned about the credit card balances." His expression shifted from annoyance to something harder, more defensive. "I told you, I handle the finances. You don't need to worry about details you don't understand." "I understand debt," I said quietly. "I understand that we're spending more than we're earning." "My business is complicated," he said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone I'd learned to recognize and hate. "There are investments and tax strategies and cash flow issues that require expertise you don't have." "Then explain them to me," I said. "Help me understand why we can afford expensive dinners downtown but not basic repairs to our apartment." David's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it, and whatever he saw there apparently took priority over our conversation about our financial future. "I have to go," he said, standing and reaching for his coat. "Where?" "Work emergency," he said without meeting my eyes. I watched him leave, knowing there was no emergency, knowing he was going to meet the woman from the restaurant or someone like her, knowing that my concern about our mounting debt was less important to him than maintaining the lifestyle that allowed him to pursue relationships I wasn't supposed to know about. For the first time in our marriage, I didn't say goodbye when he walked out the door. That night, alone in the apartment with nothing but honesty for company, I began planning changes that went beyond volunteer work and financial awareness. I began planning escape. The idea felt both terrifying and liberating. After 38 years of marriage, I'd never seriously considered life without David. My identity was so wrapped up in being his wife that imagining alternatives felt like imagining a completely different person. But the person I was becoming, suspicious, vigilant, constantly hurt by indifference and lies, wasn't someone I wanted to continue being. The woman who checked bank statements in secret and followed her husband to restaurants wasn't the woman I'd intended to become when I retired from teaching with dreams of peaceful companionship and shared adventures. If David was determined to live a separate life financed by our joint resources while pretending we were partners, I needed to start protecting myself from the long-term consequences of his choices. The next morning, I called a lawyer. "I think my husband is having an affair," I said to the receptionist who scheduled initial consultations. The words felt strange in my mouth, like a foreign language I was learning out of necessity. "I'd like to understand my options." The appointment was set for the following Tuesday. 5 days to continue pretending everything was normal while preparing for the possibility that normal wasn't sustainable anymore. During those 5 days, I paid attention to David's behavior with new eyes. Every late night, every vague explanation, every dismissal of my concerns became evidence of a pattern I could no longer ignore. He was living a double life, and I was funding it. But I was also enabling it with my silence, my acceptance, my willingness to believe explanations that didn't withstand scrutiny. That was going to change. The lawyer, Sarah Chen, was a woman about my daughter's age with kind eyes and a straightforward manner that put me at ease immediately. "Tell me what's been happening," she said, and for the first time in months, someone listened to me with complete attention. I described the financial irregularities, the mysterious evening plans, the growing distance between David and me. I mentioned the text message, the empty office building, the romantic dinner I'd witnessed. "Do you have photographs?" she asked. "Documentation of the financial issues?" I handed over copies of the bank statements, credit card bills, and the single photo I'd managed to take of David's car in the restaurant parking lot. Sarah reviewed everything carefully, occasionally asking clarifying questions or making notes. "What do you want to happen?" she finally asked. The question caught me off guard. What did I want? "I want honesty," I said. "I want to feel like I matter to the man I'm married to. I want our financial resources to benefit both of us, not just fund his separate life. And if those things aren't possible?" The silence stretched between us while I considered answers to a question I'd been avoiding. "I want to protect myself," I said finally. "I want to know that I'll be okay financially if this marriage can't be saved." Sarah nodded, her expression compassionate but businesslike. "Let's talk about your options." Over the next hour, I learned things about divorce law, asset protection, and financial planning that I'd never expected to need. Sarah explained community property rights, spousal support calculations, and the importance of documenting ongoing financial mismanagement. "You're in a better position than many women your age," she said. "You have your own pension, your own work history, and clear evidence of financial misconduct." "I don't want to punish him," I said. "I just want fairness." "Fairness is exactly what you deserve," Sarah replied. "The question is whether you can achieve it within your marriage or whether you'll need legal protection to ensure it." I left her office with homework: document everything, maintain copies of all financial records, and most importantly, decide what I was actually willing to accept versus what I deserved to expect from a marriage. The next few weeks were surreal. I continued living with David, sharing meals and domestic space, while secretly preparing for the possibility that our life together was unsalvageable. I opened a personal checking account that David had no access to, transferring small amounts from our joint account each week. I made copies of tax returns, insurance policies, and investment statements. I researched affordable apartments in neighborhoods I might actually be able to afford on my pension alone. Meanwhile, David's behavior became more careless. His phone was constantly buzzing with messages he wouldn't share. His explanations for evening absences became more creative and less believable. His treatment of me shifted from indifferent to actively dismissive, as if my presence in his life had become an inconvenience rather than a comfort. "I'm going to be traveling more," he announced one evening in February. "Business is expanding, and I need to develop new markets." "Where will you be traveling?" "Different places. The schedule isn't set yet." "For how long?" "It depends on opportunities." The vague non-answers had become his default communication style, but I was no longer willing to accept them as adequate. "I'd like specific information about your travel plans," I said. "Dates, destinations, contact information in case of emergencies." David looked at me as if I'd requested state secrets. "Why do you need all that detail?" "I'll check in when I can." "Because we're married," I said simply. "Because I care about your safety and want to be able to reach you if something happens." "Nothing's going to happen," he said, his tone suggesting the conversation was over. But I pressed on. "What if something happens to me while you're gone? What if there's a family emergency? What if I need to reach you?" "You won't," he said with a certainty that felt like a slap. That's when I understood, with crystal clarity, that I'd become completely irrelevant to David's consideration of his own life. I wasn't a partner whose needs required accommodation or even acknowledgement. I was a background presence whose concerns were obstacles to be dismissed rather than addressed. The realization was devastating but also oddly liberating. If I didn't matter to David, then his opinion of my choices didn't need to matter to me. That night, I called Sarah Chen and scheduled a follow-up appointment. "I think I'm ready to take formal steps," I told her. Are you planning to file for divorce? She asked. I'm planning to file for legal separation, I said. I want David to understand that his current behavior has consequences. If he's willing to recommit to honest partnership, maybe we can work things out. If not, at least I'll be protected. The papers were served on a Tuesday morning in March while David was drinking coffee and scrolling through his phone at our kitchen table. The process server was professional and polite, simply asking David to confirm his identity before handing him the envelope that would change everything. David's face went through several expressions as he read, confusion first, then shock, then something that looked like panic. What is this? He asked, though the bold heading made it clear enough. Legal documentation of my request for separation and asset protection, I said calmly, though my heart was racing. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. Because of what? Because I work evenings sometimes? Because I travel for business? His attempt to minimize the situation only confirmed how little he had understood, or cared about, the impact of his choices on our marriage. Because you've been having an affair, I said quietly. Because you've been lying about your activities for months. Because you've been spending our money on a lifestyle that doesn't include me while treating me like a burden rather than a partner. The silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of truths that had been spoken aloud for the first time. I don't know what you think you know, David said finally, but you're wrong. I saw you at the restaurant, I said. I know about the credit card charges. I know about the business trips that aren't business trips and the work emergencies that aren't work emergencies. David's expression shifted from denial to something harder, more calculating. So you've been spying on me. I've been trying to understand why my husband treats me like a stranger. Maybe because you've been acting like one. Questioning everything I do, checking up on me like I'm some kind of criminal. The conversation was following a pattern I recognized from other difficult discussions we'd attempted over the years. David deflecting blame, turning my legitimate concerns into evidence of my inadequacy as a wife. But this time, I had legal documents and a clear understanding of my rights. This time, his manipulation tactics felt transparent and ineffective. The separation agreement includes provisions for counseling, I said. If you're willing to work on rebuilding trust and honesty in our marriage, I'm willing to. But I won't continue accepting lies and financial deception. David stood up from the table, the legal papers scattered around his coffee cup. You're making a mistake, he said. A huge mistake that's going to cost both of us everything we've built together. We haven't built anything together in years, I replied. You've been building a separate life while I've been maintaining the illusion that we were partners. He left without another word, and I knew he was going to call someone, probably the woman from the restaurant, to discuss this unexpected development in his carefully compartmentalized life. For the first time in months, I felt like I'd taken action rather than simply reacting to circumstances beyond my control. The silence in the apartment after David left was different from the usual silence. Instead of emptiness, it felt like possibility. That afternoon, I met Rosa for our reading session at the library. Her progress with English had been remarkable, and her enthusiasm for learning was contagious. You seem different today, she said as we worked through a section about American history. Happy, maybe? I think I am, I realized with some surprise. I think I'm finally doing things that matter to me. That is good, Rosa said with her warm smile. My grandmother, she always say, you cannot water other people's gardens if your own flowers are dying. The wisdom in her simple words hit me deeply. For years, I'd been so focused on tending to David's needs and maintaining his comfort that I'd let my own life wither from neglect. But it wasn't too late to start watering my own garden. Over the next several days, David and I existed in a strange state of suspended animation. He continued his pattern of evening absences, but with less elaborate excuses. I continued my routine of volunteer work and gradual preparation for an uncertain future. The biggest difference was the absence of pretense. Neither of us was working to maintain the fiction of a happy marriage anymore. We were two people sharing space while figuring out whether we had any foundation left to build on. Sarah called with information about David's initial response to the separation papers. His attorney wants to discuss terms, she said. That's actually a positive sign. It suggests he's taking the situation seriously rather than just dismissing your concerns. The meeting was scheduled for the following week, in a conference room that felt formal and intimidating and necessary all at once. David arrived with his lawyer, a man who looked expensive and slightly predatory. I sat beside Sarah, grateful for her steady presence and clear advocacy. My client is willing to consider counseling, David's attorney began, but he disputes the characterization of his behavior in the separation documents. What specifically does he dispute? Sarah asked. The allegations of infidelity and financial misconduct. I looked across the table at David, who avoided meeting my eyes. Even now, faced with evidence and consequences, he was choosing denial over acknowledgement. I have photographs of Mr. Henderson dining intimately with another woman, Sarah said, sliding copies across the table. I have bank statements showing charges to hotels, restaurants, and services that Mrs. Henderson was not informed about or included in. David's lawyer reviewed the materials, occasionally glancing at his client with what looked like disapproval. My client is prepared to be more transparent about business expenses going forward, he said finally. Business expenses? I said, speaking for the first time. Those restaurant charges were for dates, not client meetings. Those hotel charges were for romantic getaways I wasn't invited on. David finally looked at me directly, and I saw something in his expression I hadn't expected: shame. Not shame about being caught, but genuine shame about what he'd done to our marriage, to me, to the life we'd once shared. For a moment, I thought he might actually acknowledge the truth, might take responsibility for choices that had damaged us both. Instead, he looked away again. We're willing to discuss expanded financial transparency and regular counseling sessions, his attorney said. In exchange, we'd like the separation to be withdrawn and these proceedings to be kept confidential. I looked at Sarah, who raised her eyebrows in a way that suggested the decision was mine to make. I'll consider the offer, I said, but I want to see actual changes in behavior, not just promises. What would those changes look like? David's attorney asked. Honesty about where he spends his time, I said. Access to all financial accounts and statements. An end to whatever relationship he's been pursuing outside our marriage. And genuine effort in counseling, not just attendance. David whispered something to his lawyer, who nodded and made notes. We'll discuss these terms and get back to you, the attorney said. After they left, Sarah and I sat in the empty conference room reviewing what had just happened. How do you feel? She asked. Exhausted, I said. But also relieved. At least everything is out in the open now. The offer to try counseling could be genuine, Sarah said. Or it could be an attempt to buy time while he figures out how to protect his assets. How will I know which one it is? By his behavior over the next few weeks. Actions matter more than agreements. That evening, David and I had the most honest conversation we'd had in years. I know you don't trust me, he said as we sat in our living room, the legal documents still scattered on the kitchen table like evidence of our failure. I don't, I confirmed. But I want to. I haven't been perfect, he said, carefully avoiding more specific admissions. You've been having an affair, I said. Let's call it what it is. He was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands, and I wondered if this would be the moment when honesty finally became possible between us. Yes, he said quietly. I have. The admission hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd been certain of the truth for weeks. Hearing him acknowledge it made it real in a way that photographs and bank statements couldn't. For how long? I asked. 6 months, he said. Maybe 7. Why? Another long silence. When David finally looked at me, his expression was a mixture of guilt and something that looked almost like surprise, as if he'd never really examined his own motivations. I felt invisible, he said. Like I didn't matter to you anymore. The irony was so profound I almost laughed. You felt invisible? After you retired, it seemed like you didn't need me anymore. You had your books and your volunteer work and your own routine. I felt like I was just someone who happened to live in the same apartment. I stared at him, trying to process the disconnect between his perception and my reality. I've been trying to connect with you for years, I said. I've been asking about your work, trying to be included in your life, hoping for conversations that went deeper than logistics. You've been checking up on me, he said. Questioning my schedule, wanting to know where I was every minute. Because you were lying to me every day, I said. Because you were building a relationship with someone else while treating me like I was invisible. We sat in silence, each of us apparently seeing the same marriage from completely different perspectives. I messed up, David said eventually. I know that. I don't know how to fix it. Do you want to fix it? I asked. Or do you want to continue the relationship you've been having while keeping me as the wife who provides domestic stability? I want to fix it, he said, and for the first time in months, he sounded like the man I'd fallen in love with decades earlier. Then you'll have to end the affair completely, I said. And you'll have to be transparent about everything: money, time, communication. And you'll have to be patient while I learn to trust you again. What if you can't? He asked. What if we try counseling and honesty and all the rest of it, and you still can't forgive me? It was a fair question, and one I'd been avoiding thinking about too deeply. Then we'll know we tried everything, I said. And we'll be able to end the marriage with honesty instead of continuing to live lies. David nodded slowly. I'll call Dr. Martinez tomorrow, he said, referring to a counselor we'd consulted briefly years earlier during a financial crisis. And I'll give you passwords for all my accounts. And the other woman? I'll end it, he said. Completely. That night, I slept better than I had in months. Not because our problems were solved, but because they were finally in the open where we could address them directly. The counseling sessions began the following week. Dr. Martinez was a patient woman in her 50s who had a gift for asking questions that cut through defensive patterns to reach underlying truths. David, can you help Margaret understand why the affair felt necessary to you? She asked during our third session. I felt like she'd moved on without me, David said. Like retirement gave her a whole new life that didn't include me. Margaret, how do you respond to that? I felt like he'd moved on without me years ago, I said. Like his work became more important than our relationship, and I was expected to be satisfied with whatever attention was left over. Dr. Martinez nodded. So both of you were feeling disconnected and invisible in different ways. But I didn't have an affair, I said. I didn't lie about where I was spending our money. That's true, Dr. Martinez agreed. David, can you help us understand why deception felt like your best option for addressing the disconnection? David struggled with the question, and his struggle felt genuinely thoughtful rather than simply evasive. I was ashamed, he said finally. Ashamed that I was 61 and felt like I needed attention from someone else to feel attractive and interesting. Ashamed that I was spending money we could probably use for other things. Ashamed that I was hurting Margaret but didn't know how to stop. It was the most honest he'd been about his motivations, and it helped me understand that his choices, while damaging, hadn't been malicious. Margaret, what do you need from David to begin rebuilding trust? I need to feel like I matter to him again, I said. I need to be included in his life instead of just supporting it from the background. What would inclusion look like specifically? The question forced me to think concretely about changes I wanted rather than just expressing general hurt. I'd like to be invited to some of his work events, I said. I'd like us to make social plans together instead of him making plans that don't include me. I'd like to feel like my opinions and interests matter to him. David, how do those requests sound to you? Reasonable, he said. I think I got so used to thinking of Margaret as not interested in business things that I stopped giving her chances to be interested. Were you not interested in business things? Dr. Martinez asked me. I don't know, I said honestly. I was never given the opportunity to find out. Over the following weeks, David made visible efforts to change patterns that had developed over years. He shared his calendar with me, invited me to a client appreciation dinner, included me in conversations about work challenges and successes. The changes felt tentative and sometimes awkward, like learning to dance together again after decades of moving to different music. But they also felt genuine. David seemed relieved to be honest about his daily life rather than constantly managing information and maintaining stories about where he'd been and who he'd seen. I forgot how much energy lying takes, he said one evening after sharing detailed information about a difficult client situation. It's exhausting to keep track of what you've said to who. The financial transparency was harder for both of us. David had to acknowledge spending patterns that were selfish and unsustainable. I had to confront how completely I'd abdicated responsibility for our financial security. I should have been paying attention all along, I told Sarah during one of our follow-up meetings. I let David handle everything because it was easier than learning about investments and tax issues. But you also trusted your spouse to make decisions that benefited your partnership, Sarah replied. That's not abdication, that's normal division of labor in a marriage. Normal division of labor doesn't usually result in one partner funding the other partner's affair. Sarah smiled sympathetically. No, it doesn't. But now you're both working toward a division of labor that includes oversight and shared decision-making. The progress was slow but steady. David ended his relationship with the other woman, though not without difficulty. He came home from that conversation looking emotionally drained but also somehow lighter. How did she react? I asked, surprised by my own curiosity about a woman I'd never met but who had been central to our marital crisis. She was upset, David said. She thought we were building toward something more serious. Were you? David considered the question seriously. I think I was avoiding thinking about what we were building toward. It was easier to just enjoy the attention and the excitement without considering long-term consequences. Did you love her? I asked, not sure I wanted to hear the answer but needing to know anyway. I thought I might, David said carefully. But now I think I was more in love with feeling interesting and attractive again. The honesty was painful but also healing. For the first time since discovering the affair, I felt like David was actually considering my feelings rather than just managing them. 3 months into counseling, we had our first major test. David was invited to a weekend conference in Milwaukee, the kind of professional event that had previously been occasions for extended romantic getaways. I'd like you to come with me, he said when he mentioned the invitation. The request was exactly what I'd been hoping for, but it also felt loaded with significance for both of us. Are you sure? I asked. Won't I be boring compared to your usual conference companions? David winced at the reference to his past behavior. I deserve that, he said. But yes, I'm sure. I want you there. I want people to meet my wife. The weekend was a revelation. David's colleagues were welcoming and interesting, and many of them expressed surprise at finally meeting me. David talks about you all the time, one woman said, but he's never brought you to any of our events. I've been trying to convince him to include me for years, I replied, and David had the grace to look embarrassed. But more important than the social aspect was watching David interact professionally. He was good at his job, well respected by his peers, genuinely knowledgeable about market trends and client relations. The business success he claimed wasn't fictional, even if the way he'd been using that success had been problematic. You're impressive in professional settings, I told him during a break between conference sessions. I can see why clients trust you. Really? He asked, and I heard genuine pleasure in his voice. I wasn't sure you'd be interested in this world. I'm interested in everything that's important to you, I said. I always have been. I just needed to be invited in. That evening, we had dinner at a restaurant overlooking Lake Michigan, just the two of us, the first romantic evening we'd shared in longer than I could remember. I'm sorry, David said as we watched the sun set over water that reflected light like scattered diamonds. I'm sorry for shutting you out, for lying, for making you feel invisible while I was feeling invisible too. I'm sorry too, I said. I'm sorry I stopped fighting for inclusion in your life. I'm sorry I let myself become someone who assumed the worst instead of asking direct questions. We sat in comfortable silence, holding hands across the table like teenagers on a first date, both of us conscious that we were trying to rebuild something that had been damaged but not necessarily destroyed. Do you think we can make this work? David asked. I think we already are making it work, I replied. Slowly, imperfectly, but honestly. The drive home from Milwaukee felt different from previous returns from David's business trips. Instead of coming back to a life where I'd been irrelevant to his professional experience, we were returning together to a life we were actively building rather than simply maintaining. But our progress was about to face its biggest challenge yet. 2 weeks after the Milwaukee conference, Linda from David's office called me directly. Margaret, she said, her voice carrying the same troubled tone I remembered from that evening at the restaurant. I need to tell you something. My heart sank. After months of careful rebuilding, was there another revelation that would undermine everything we'd been working toward? What is it? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. It's about the woman David was seeing, Linda said. She's been calling the office constantly since he ended things with her. She's threatening to cause problems for him professionally if he doesn't reconsider. What kind of problems? She's claiming their relationship was more serious than it actually was. She's suggesting she has documentation of business expense accounts being used for personal purposes. The information hit me like a cold wave. Even ended, the affair was continuing to threaten our attempts at rebuilding. Has David told you about this? Linda asked. No, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He hasn't mentioned any ongoing contact with her. I thought he should handle it himself, Linda continued, but it's been going on for a week now, and I was afraid you'd find out some other way. Thank you for telling me, I said, though I felt sick about what this meant for the trust we'd been carefully reconstructing. When David came home that evening, I was waiting for him with a directness that had become more natural over our months of counseling. Linda called me today, I said without preamble. David's face went pale. What did she tell you? That your former girlfriend has been calling the office. That she's threatening to cause professional problems if you don't resume contact with her. David sat down heavily at our kitchen table, his shoulders sagging under the weight of a problem he'd been trying to handle alone. I didn't want to worry you, he said. I thought I could manage the situation without involving you. By lying about it? I asked. By pretending it wasn't happening? By protecting you from drama that had nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with me, I said. It's about our marriage, our finances, your reputation, our future. How is that not my concern? David was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him struggling between old patterns of information management and new commitments to transparency. You're right, he said finally. I should have told you immediately. What exactly is she threatening? She says she has copies of credit card receipts from dinners and hotels. She's claiming I told her I was going to divorce you and marry her. Did you tell her that? No, David said firmly. I never said anything about divorce. I was careful never to make promises about the future. But you didn't discourage her from hoping for promises. No, he admitted. I didn't discourage her hopes because her hopes made me feel important and desired. The honesty was painful but also reassuring. David was continuing to choose truth over comfortable fiction, even when truth reflected poorly on his past choices. What does she want now? I asked. She wants me to meet with her to discuss our future, David said, using air quotes around her words. She's implying that if I don't, she'll send documentation of our relationship to my professional associates. Documentation that would reveal financial misconduct. Yes. I sat with this information, trying to process the implications for our marriage and David's career. What do you want to do? I asked. David looked surprised by the question. What do I want to do? Yes. How do you want to handle this situation? I want to ignore her completely, David said. I want to pretend she doesn't exist and hope she eventually goes away. That's not really an option if she's threatening professional consequences. Then I want to meet with her once, explain clearly that our relationship is over permanently, and ask her to stop contacting me or my workplace. Do you think that will work? I don't know, David said honestly. But I think it's worth trying before we consider legal options. The fact that he'd said "we" when discussing legal options felt significant. For months, David had been handling this crisis as an individual problem. Now he was finally approaching it as something that affected our partnership. I want to go with you, I said. To meet with her? Yes. I think she needs to see that we're working on our marriage, that you're not available for the kind of relationship she's hoping to resume. David looked uncertain. That could be confrontational. It could also be clarifying, I replied. Right now, she's operating under the assumption that I'm an obstacle to what she wants rather than an equal partner in what you're choosing. We discussed the idea with Dr. Martinez during our next counseling session. What would you hope to accomplish by attending this meeting? She asked me. I want to make our commitment to rebuilding our marriage clear to everyone involved, I said. I want David's former girlfriend to understand that she's not competing with an unhappy wife who might be easily displaced, but engaging with a couple who are actively choosing each other. David, how do you feel about Margaret's involvement? Scared, David said honestly. But also relieved. I've been trying to handle this alone because I felt responsible for creating the problem. But Margaret is right, this affects both of us. What's the worst thing that could happen if Margaret comes to the meeting? The other woman could become hostile, David said. She could say things designed to hurt Margaret or damage our progress. And what's the best thing that could happen? She could understand that what we had is really over, that I'm committed to my marriage, and she could stop the threats and phone calls. Dr. Martinez turned to me. Are you prepared for the possibility of hearing details about David's relationship that might be painful? I think hearing them in a controlled context where I can respond directly might be less damaging than imagining them or learning about them indirectly, I said. All right, Dr. Martinez said. If you both agree this is the best approach, let's talk about how to structure the conversation to maximize the chance of a productive outcome. The meeting was scheduled for the following Saturday at a coffee shop in Lincoln Park, neutral territory that was public enough to discourage dramatic scenes but private enough to allow honest conversation. I spent the week fluctuating between confidence in our decision and terror about what I might learn or how I might react. But ultimately, the unknown felt less threatening than the ongoing uncertainty of threats and phone calls that could destabilize David's career and our rebuilt trust. Saturday morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of Chicago wind that cuts through every layer of clothing. David and I rode the train together in mostly comfortable silence, both of us nervous but committed to facing the situation directly. The coffee shop was crowded with weekend customers, families with children, students with laptops, couples reading newspapers and sharing pastries. Normal life continuing while we prepared for a conversation that felt anything but normal. She was already there when we arrived, sitting at a corner table with her back to the window. I recognized her immediately from my glimpse through the restaurant glass months earlier, but seeing her up close was still jarring. She was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 40s, with professionally highlighted hair and clothes that suggested both success and careful attention to appearance. She was attractive in conventional ways, but what struck me most was how nervous she looked, almost as nervous as I felt. David had texted her that I would be joining them, so our presence together wasn't a surprise. But her expression when she saw us approach suggested she hadn't fully processed what our joint appearance might mean for the conversation she'd been expecting to have. Hello, Jennifer, David said as we sat down across from her. Hello, she replied, her voice carefully controlled. Margaret, I assume? Yes, I said. Thank you for agreeing to meet with both of us. The politeness felt surreal, but it also felt necessary. Whatever conversation we were about to have needed to begin from a place of basic civility. I wasn't sure you knew about me, Jennifer said, looking directly at me with what seemed like genuine curiosity. I've known for several months, I replied. David and I have been working on rebuilding our marriage since January. Jennifer's expression shifted, and I saw something that looked like surprise and perhaps disappointment. Did he tell you we were planning a future together? She asked. I looked at David, who seemed to be bracing himself for whatever I might say. He told me that you'd been having an affair, I said carefully. He told me that he'd never discussed divorce or made promises about leaving our marriage. But he was unhappy, Jennifer said, her voice taking on an edge of defensiveness. He told me he felt invisible and unappreciated at home. He was unhappy, I agreed. We both were. That's why we're in counseling and working on changes that address the problems in our marriage. Jennifer looked back and forth between David and me, and I could see her trying to process information that didn't match the narrative she'd constructed about their relationship. David, she said, turning her full attention to him, when you said you needed time to figure things out, I thought you meant time to plan how to end your marriage. I'm sorry if I gave you that impression, David said quietly. I was confused about what I wanted, and I wasn't honest about the fact that Margaret and I were working on our problems. So this is just temporary? Jennifer asked. This reconciliation attempt? No, I said, answering for both of us. This is our marriage. We're not attempting to reconcile, we're rebuilding a partnership that we both value. Jennifer was quiet for a long moment, stirring her coffee with unnecessary intensity. I fell in love with you, she said to David, her voice now carrying genuine pain rather than manipulation. I know, David replied with what sounded like sincere regret. And I cared about you too. But I wasn't honest with you about my situation or my intentions, and that was unfair to everyone involved. So what am I supposed to do now? Jennifer asked. Pretend the last 8 months didn't happen? Pretend that what we had wasn't real. What you had was real, I said, surprising both David and Jennifer with my response. But it was also based on incomplete information and circumstances that have changed. Jennifer looked at me with something that might have been recognition or respect. You're not what I expected, she said. What did you expect? I expected someone bitter and angry who was holding David back from happiness. I was bitter and angry, I said honestly. But I was also committed to fighting for my marriage instead of just accepting its deterioration. And that's made a difference? I looked at David, who was listening to our conversation with an expression of intense concentration. It's made a huge difference, I said. For both of us. Jennifer sat back in her chair, and I could see her processing the reality of our situation versus the possibilities she'd been imagining. I've been calling his office, she said finally, addressing me rather than David. I've been making threats about exposing the financial aspects of our relationship. We know, I said. That's partly why we wanted to meet with you directly. I was hurt, Jennifer continued. And I was hoping to pressure him into reconsidering. I understand, I said, and I genuinely did. But continuing to interfere in David's professional life isn't going to change the fact that he's committed to rebuilding our marriage. Jennifer turned to David. Is that true? Are you really committed to making your marriage work? Yes, David said without hesitation. Completely. Even though I could make things difficult for you professionally? Even then, David said. What Margaret and I are building together is more important than protecting myself from consequences of past mistakes. Jennifer stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I can see that, she said. I can see that you're different than you were 6 months ago. We both are, I said. Jennifer finished her coffee and gathered her purse, preparing to leave. I won't call your office anymore, she said to David. And I won't cause problems with your professional reputation. Thank you, David said with obvious relief. Jennifer stood to leave, then turned back to me. I hope it works out for you both, she said, and she sounded like she meant it. After she left, David and I sat in the coffee shop for another hour, processing what had just happened. How do you feel? David asked. Surprisingly okay, I said. She seems like a decent person who got involved in a complicated situation. I never intended to hurt anyone, David said. Not her, not you. I know, I said. But intentions don't always prevent damage. Are we going to be okay? David asked. After everything that's happened, after all the lies and complications and threats. I considered the question seriously. 6 months earlier, I would have given him the answer he wanted to hear, the reassurance that would smooth over difficult truths and allow us to return to comfortable patterns. But I'd learned to value honesty over comfort, even when honesty was harder for both of us. I think we're going to be better than okay, I said finally. I think we're going to be honest and connected and genuinely partners in ways we haven't been for years. Even though I betrayed your trust? Because you betrayed my trust, I said. Because we had to face the worst parts of our marriage and decide whether we could build something better from what was left. David reached across the table and took my hand, the same gesture he'd made decades earlier when we were young and thought love was simple and permanent. I love you, he said. I love the woman you've become through this, and I love the man I'm becoming because of your willingness to fight for us. I love you too, I said, and for the first time in months, the words felt like truth rather than hope. The ride home was quiet but comfortable, both of us lost in thoughts about the conversation we just had and the future we were still building together. That evening, we cooked dinner together for the first time in longer than I could remember. David chopped vegetables while I prepared pasta, and we talked about mundane things, the grocery list, a movie we might see, plans for the upcoming weekend. Normal conversation between people who were learning to be genuinely interested in each other's daily lives. I want to go back to school, I said as we were cleaning up after dinner. For what? David asked with what sounded like genuine curiosity rather than judgment. Maybe library science, I said. Or social work. Something that uses my teaching skills but expands them in new directions. That sounds perfect for you, David said. When would you start? Next fall, maybe. If we can figure out how to afford it. We'll figure it out, David said. Your education is worth prioritizing in our budget. The casual assumption that my dreams warranted financial support felt like another small miracle in our ongoing reconstruction. 6 months later, I was enrolled in a graduate program in library science at Dominican University, commuting to River Forest 3 days a week for classes that challenged and energized me in ways I hadn't experienced since my early teaching days. David had restructured his business practices to include more weekend and evening availability, allowing him to be home more during my study time and to take over domestic responsibilities he'd previously left entirely to me. Our marriage wasn't perfect, but it was honest and equitable and built around mutual support rather than one-sided sacrifice. The most significant change was that we talked to each other like friends who were genuinely interested in each other's lives, concerns, and dreams. How was your research methods class? David might ask when I came home from a challenging day at school. Difficult but fascinating, I'd reply, then spend the next hour describing what I'd learned about information organization and human learning patterns while David listened with attention that felt present and engaged. When David faced professional challenges, he'd share them with me and ask for my perspective, treating my opinions as valuable rather than irrelevant. The Morrison account is thinking of switching to a different agent, he might say over dinner. What do you think about my idea for retaining their business? We'd spend the evening discussing strategies and solutions, my teaching experience with difficult personalities proving useful in ways neither of us had anticipated. The financial transparency that had begun as a crisis management necessity became a foundation for shared decision-making about everything from daily expenses to retirement planning. The school expenses are going to be higher next semester, I'd tell David after reviewing tuition statements. Do we need to adjust other parts of our budget? Let's look at the numbers together, he'd reply, and we'd spend the evening reviewing finances like partners who trusted each other to make wise choices for their shared future. A year after that terrible January evening when Linda warned me not to go to the restaurant, David and I celebrated our 40th wedding anniversary with a weekend in Wisconsin, staying at a bed and breakfast that was romantic and peaceful and entirely focused on celebrating the life we'd built together. Do you ever regret not walking away? David asked as we sat by a lake that reflected sunset colors like scattered jewels. Do I regret forgiving you? I asked. I mean, do you regret fighting so hard for something that came so close to being destroyed completely? I considered the question seriously. The past year had been difficult in ways I could never have imagined when I was a young bride assuming that love was simple and permanent. But it had also been rich in ways I couldn't have anticipated then either. I don't regret fighting for the marriage we have now, I said finally. I might have regretted fighting for the marriage we had before, the one where I was invisible and you were dishonest and we were both lonely while living in the same apartment. We almost lost everything, David said. We almost lost everything we thought we had, I corrected. What we almost lost was built on misunderstandings and assumptions and patterns that weren't serving either of us well. And what we have now? What we have now is built on honesty and mutual respect and genuine partnership, I said. It's harder work than what we had before, but it's also more authentic and more satisfying. David raised his wine glass toward the darkening sky. To marriages that survive their own destruction and become something better. To partnerships that are chosen daily instead of just assumed permanently, I added, clinking my glass against his. That night, lying in an unfamiliar bed in an unfamiliar room while David slept peacefully beside me, I reflected on the journey that had brought us from crisis to celebration. The affair had been devastating, but it had also been information. Information about problems in our marriage that needed addressing, about patterns of communication and connection that weren't serving either of us well. The financial deception had been frightening, but it had also been opportunity. Opportunity to learn shared responsibility for our economic future, to make decisions based on transparent information rather than assumptions and trust that weren't being honored. The lying had been heartbreaking, but it had also been education. Education about the importance of honest communication, about the difference between privacy and secrecy, about the way deception corrodes intimacy even when the underlying relationship has genuine love at its foundation. I wouldn't recommend the path we'd taken to anyone. The pain and uncertainty and near loss of everything we'd built over 4 decades of marriage wasn't something I'd wish on any couple. But I also couldn't deny that the marriage we'd rebuilt was stronger, more honest, and more genuinely satisfying than the marriage we'd almost lost. 2 years later, I graduated with my master's degree in library science and took a position as a community outreach librarian, developing literacy programs for adults and seniors who were learning new skills or pursuing delayed educational dreams. David attended my graduation ceremony, sitting in the front row with a bouquet of roses and an expression of pride that was unmistakably genuine. I'm proud of you, he said as we walked across the university campus after the ceremony. Not just for getting your degree, but for having the courage to pursue dreams that mattered to you. I'm proud of us, I replied. For building a marriage where both people's dreams matter equally. My new job was everything I'd hoped it would be. I worked with students like Rosa, immigrants, and older adults who were pursuing education with determination that inspired me daily. I developed programs that connected people with resources they needed for personal and professional growth. I felt useful and valued and connected to a larger community in ways that fed my soul. David's business continued to thrive, but now his success translated into shared benefits rather than mysterious expenses. We were able to save money for retirement, travel to places we dreamed of visiting, and invest in experiences that enriched our life together. More importantly, David's professional life became something I was included in rather than excluded from. I attended industry events where I met his colleagues and clients as an equal partner rather than a background presence. David sought my advice on business decisions and valued my perspective on professional relationships. We'd become genuine partners in ways we'd never been, even during the early years of our marriage when passion had masked underlying patterns of inequality and miscommunication. 3 years after our crisis and reconstruction, we faced our first major test as a rebuilt couple when David was offered a promotion that would require relocation to St. Louis. In the past, such a decision would have been made unilaterally, with my preferences considered secondary to professional opportunities. I would have been expected to support whatever choice advanced David's career, regardless of how it affected my own life and goals. But now we approached the decision as equal partners whose needs and dreams were equally important. It would mean leaving your new job, David said when he first mentioned the opportunity. And leaving the community connections we've both been building here. It would also mean significant advancement in your career, I replied. And potentially better financial security for our retirement. We spent weeks discussing the pros and cons, visiting St. Louis to assess the community and opportunities, researching library systems where I might continue my work, and considering the impact on our extended family and friendship networks. What do you want to do? I asked David after we'd gathered all the information we could. I want to make the decision that's best for both of us, David replied. The promotion is attractive, but not if it means sacrificing the life we've been building together here. And I want to support your professional success, I said, but not at the expense of my own sense of purpose and community. In the end, David declined the promotion, choosing instead to pursue advancement opportunities within his current company that would allow us to remain in Chicago near the life we'd been building together. Do you regret not taking the promotion? I asked him several months later, after he'd successfully negotiated a different advancement that increased his responsibilities and income without requiring relocation. Not for a moment, David said. The success I have now is more meaningful because it's built around our life together rather than at the expense of it. The decision felt symbolic of how completely our dynamic had changed. We'd moved from a marriage where one person's needs took priority to a partnership where both people's needs were genuinely considered and balanced. Our children, now adults with their own families, noticed the changes in our relationship and occasionally commented on them during visits. You and Dad seem different, our daughter Sarah observed during a holiday dinner. More connected, somehow. We went through a difficult period a few years ago, I said carefully, not wanting to burden her with details of David's affair but also not wanting to pretend our marriage had always been ideal. We learned to talk to each other differently, David added. To include each other in our lives more intentionally. It shows, Michael said. You seem like you actually enjoy each other's company now. The observation was accurate. We did enjoy each other's company in ways that had been missing for years before our crisis. We chose to spend time together not just because we were married, but because we genuinely found each other interesting and supportive. We took evening walks through Lincoln Park, not because we needed exercise but because we discovered that moving side by side through familiar neighborhoods created space for conversations that didn't happen as naturally at home. We tried new restaurants not because we needed to eat out, but because sharing new experiences had become a pleasure we'd learned to prioritize. We read books and discussed them, watched movies and shared observations, planned trips that reflected both of our interests rather than compromises that satisfied neither of us completely. We'd become friends as well as spouses, companions as well as partners. 5 years after that January evening when Linda whispered her warning, I was having coffee with Rosa, whose English had become fluent and whose citizenship ceremony we'd attended the previous spring. You seem very happy, Rosa observed as we reviewed materials for her English conversation group. You and your husband, you have found good balance. It took us a long time to learn how to balance both people's needs, I said. And we made a lot of mistakes along the way. My grandmother, she always say, good marriages are not perfect from the beginning. They become perfect through the work of two people who choose each other every day. Rosa's grandmother's wisdom captured something essential about what David and I had learned. Our marriage hadn't failed because it had problems. It had nearly failed because we'd stopped doing the work of choosing each other daily, stopped prioritizing transparency and mutual support and genuine partnership. The affair had been a symptom of that failure, not its cause. The rebuilding had required both of us to change patterns we'd developed over decades, to learn new ways of communicating and connecting and making decisions together. It had been the hardest work either of us had ever done, but also the most rewarding. That evening, I shared Rose's grandmother's quote with David over dinner. "Do you think we choose each other every day now?" I asked. David considered the question seriously. "I think we choose the marriage we want to have every day," he said. "We choose honesty over comfort. We choose inclusion over independence. We choose partnership over convenience." "And do you think that will sustain us through whatever challenges we face in the future?" "I think the skills we've learned will sustain us," David replied. "The ability to face problems directly instead of avoiding them. The commitment to transparency even when it's difficult. The understanding that both people's needs matter equally. And the willingness to fight for what we've built." "That too," David agreed. "The willingness to fight for us." As I write this, 7 years have passed since that cold January evening when I first suspected that David's claims about working late weren't entirely honest. 7 years since Linda warned me not to go to the restaurant where David supposedly had client dinners. David and I will celebrate our 45th wedding anniversary next month. We're planning a trip to Ireland, a destination we've dreamed of visiting since our early married years but never prioritized in our budget or schedule. The trip represents many things: shared dreams finally pursued, financial stability built through genuine partnership, time together that we choose because we value each other's company rather than simply fulfill marital obligations. But mostly it represents the marriage we've built on the foundation of the marriage we almost lost. We're not the same people who stood at an altar 45 years ago promising to love and honor each other for better or worse. We're not even the same people who nearly divorced 7 years ago when worse seemed to outweigh better in ways that felt insurmountable. We're people who learned that marriage isn't a state you achieve and then maintain through good intentions. It's a relationship you actively create and recreate through daily choices about honesty, respect, inclusion, and mutual support. We're people who discovered that love, real, sustaining, adult love, isn't what you feel when someone meets all your needs effortlessly. It's what you choose when you decide to build a life that serves both people's deepest needs through conscious effort and ongoing commitment. We're people who understand that betrayal, while devastating, isn't necessarily the end of a relationship that has genuine foundation beneath its surface problems. Sometimes betrayal is information about what isn't working, opportunity to address issues that have been growing in silence, invitation to build something more honest and equitable than what existed before. I wouldn't choose the path we took. The pain of discovering David's affair, the uncertainty of not knowing whether our marriage could be saved, the hard work of rebuilding trust and establishing new patterns of communication, none of it was easy or pleasant or something I'd recommend to other couples. But I also can't deny that the marriage we have now is better than the marriage we had before the crisis. More honest, more equitable, more genuinely satisfying for both of us. We matter to each other now in ways that feel conscious and chosen rather than assumed and taken for granted. We see each other now as full people with individual needs and dreams and perspectives that deserve respect and consideration. We support each other now through genuine partnership rather than one-sided sacrifice disguised as love. We've learned that marriage at its best isn't the merging of two people into one unit where individual identity disappears. It's the creation of a third entity, the relationship itself, that serves both individuals' growth and happiness while providing stability and support and shared meaning. Our marriage has become a place where both people can flourish rather than an arrangement where one person's flourishing requires the other person's diminishment. If you've listened to this story and recognized elements of your own relationship, the gradual disconnection, the lies that seem small at first but grow into chasms, the pattern of one person's needs taking priority while the other person slowly disappears, I want you to know that you have options beyond enduring or leaving. You have the option of fighting for something better. You have the option of demanding honesty and equality and genuine partnership. You have the option of refusing to accept less than you deserve while also working to become the partner who deserves what you're asking for. It's not easy work. It requires courage to face uncomfortable truths about yourself and your relationship. It requires persistence when change feels slow and uncertain. It requires faith that love can be rebuilt on stronger foundations when both people are committed to the rebuilding process. But it's possible. Transformation is possible. Marriages that seem broken beyond repair can be rebuilt into relationships that are stronger and more satisfying than what existed before. Not all marriages can or should be saved. Some relationships lack the foundation of genuine care and respect that makes reconstruction possible. But many marriages that seem hopeless are actually marriages where good people have developed bad patterns that can be changed through awareness, effort, and professional support. If your marriage feels like mine did 7 years ago, characterized by distance, deception, inequality, and loneliness despite living with another person, please consider fighting for something better before you accept defeat. Consider the possibility that what looks like the end might actually be the beginning of something more honest and more satisfying than you've experienced before. Consider the possibility that you deserve partnership, not just companionship. That you deserve honesty, not just politeness. That you deserve to be seen and valued and included, not just tolerated and taken for granted. Consider the possibility that love at its best isn't what you feel when everything is easy, but what you choose when you decide to build something beautiful from materials that seem broken. David and I chose to rebuild. It was the hardest thing we've ever done together, but also the most important. Our marriage isn't perfect. We still have disagreements and misunderstandings and moments when old patterns threaten to resurface. But we have tools now for addressing problems directly instead of letting them fester in silence. We have commitment to honesty even when truth is uncomfortable. We have understanding that both people's happiness matters equally and requires ongoing attention and effort. We have a relationship that feels chosen rather than simply endured. And on our upcoming trip to Ireland, when we stand together on cliffs overlooking the Atlantic Ocean, we'll be people who nearly lost each other but chose instead to find each other more completely than ever before. We'll be people who learned that the best marriages aren't the ones that never face serious problems, but the ones where serious problems become opportunities for going deeper, loving better, and choosing each other more consciously. We'll be people who discovered that sometimes you have to lose what you think you want in order to find what you actually need. Have you ever lived through something similar to what I've shared with you today? Have you felt invisible in your own marriage, or discovered that the person you trusted most wasn't being honest with you? Have you wondered whether love can survive betrayal, whether trust can be rebuilt after deception, whether marriages that feel broken beyond repair might actually be marriages that are ready for transformation? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. And if this story has touched you in any way, if it's given you hope or helped you feel less alone or inspired you to fight for something better in your own relationship, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. Your support helps me continue sharing stories that matter, opening my heart in ways that might light a path for others walking through their own dark nights toward their own possibilities of dawn. Thank you for listening. Thank you for letting me share the most difficult and most important chapter of my life with you. And thank you for believing, as I now do completely, that love, real love, conscious love, chosen love, is always worth fighting for.